Some nights don't knock twice. They wait to see who you are before they decide what you deserve, the old man would say. And on that winter night, the wind carried a kind of cold that didn't just bite the skin. It settled in your bones like a quiet warning, and Ethan Cole felt it long before he heard the knock. A slow, deliberate sound against the wood of his door, not desperate, not loud, just certain, like whoever stood outside already knew he would answer. And for a moment, he didn't move, his hand resting near the edge of the table where a cold cup of coffee sat untouched, the fire behind him burning low, casting long shadows that stretched across the cabin walls like memories he didn't care to revisit. Because out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, nothing came to your door without bringing something with it, and rarely was it anything good. And the wind howled again, slipping through the cracks in the boards, carrying the faint scent of snow and distant pine. And then came the knock again, same rhythm, same patience, and Ethan stood slowly, boots heavy against the wooden floor, each step measured, cautious, the kind of caution that kept a man alive when the world around him didn't play fair. And as he reached the door, he paused, just for a second, because there was something in that silence between knocks that didn't feel right. Not fear, not exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize a choice is already waiting for you before you even make it. And when he finally pulled the door open, the cold rushed in first, sharp and unforgiving, carrying with it the sight of a woman standing just beyond the threshold, her figure wrapped in worn fabric that barely held against the night, her breath visible in short, steady clouds, and her hands. There was something about her hands, faint stains, dark against the pale light, not fresh, not violent, just there, like a story she hadn't told yet. And her eyes met his, steady, unflinching, not pleading, not broken. And that was the first thing that unsettled him, because people who begged usually looked away, but she didn't. She held his gaze like she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. And when she spoke, her voice was low, carrying a calm that didn't match the cold. "I need warmth," she said. Simple, direct, no tremble, no rush. And then after a breath, "I will repay you." And the words hung there between them, not as a promise, but as a fact. And Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, like he'd heard something like that before in a life he barely remembered. And behind her, the darkness stretched wide and empty, the kind of empty that could hide anything. And he knew what the town would say if they saw this, knew about the posters nailed to the saloon wall, the quiet talk of money for turning people in, knew how easy it would be to close the door, to pretend he never heard the knock, to let the night take care of its own. And for a second, his hand tightened on the edge of the door, the weight of that choice settling in, heavy as iron. But then the wind shifted again, colder this time, sharper, and the woman didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't beg again. She just stood there, waiting, like she understood something he didn't. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in front of him, and stepped aside without a word, the door opening wider, the firelight spilling out into the night. And for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold still as she crossed the threshold, the warmth touching her face, softening the edges of the cold that clung to her. And the door closed behind her with a dull thud, sealing them both inside. And neither of them spoke as she moved toward the fire, her steps quiet, controlled, like someone used to walking through places where noise could cost you more than comfort. And Ethan watched her from a distance, arms folded, eyes sharp, taking in every detail, the way she held herself, the way her shoulders stayed straight despite the exhaustion written in the lines of her face. And the silence stretched, not empty, but full, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. And outside, far off in the dark, something moved, a faint rhythm, carried on the wind, distant but steady, the kind of sound a man who lived alone learned to recognize. And Ethan's gaze flicked toward the window, just for a second, before returning to the woman by his fire. And for the first time that night, he wondered not who she was, but what had followed her here, and whether opening that door had already set something in motion that neither of them could stop. The fire snapped softly, a low rhythm that filled the cabin with just enough warmth to remind a man he was still alive. And Ethan Cole stood with his back near the table, watching the woman without letting it show too plainly. Because out here, you learn to observe before you understood, and sometimes you never understood at all. and she moved closer to the flames, extending her hands just enough to feel the heat without reaching for it like someone desperate. Her fingers steady despite the cold that still clung to her skin, and that alone told Ethan more than words ever could, because people who had truly given up did not hold themselves like that. They collapsed, they begged, they looked for permission to exist, but she did none of those things. She simply stood, as if the fire belonged to her, just as much as it did to him. And after a long moment, she spoke again, quieter this time, not asking, just stating, "You live far from the road." And Ethan gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving her. "Far enough," he said, his voice even, careful, and she glanced toward the walls, the worn wood, the few tools hanging in their places, the kind of space that spoke of a man who needed little and trusted less. And then her gaze returned to him, measuring, not judging, and something about that look unsettled him more than any threat could have, because it felt like she was seeing something he had spent years keeping buried beneath routine and silence. And outside, the wind shifted again, carrying that distant sound closer now, faint but unmistakable, hooves against frozen ground, slow, deliberate, not the hurried chaos of travelers lost in a storm, but something organized, something patient, and Ethan heard it clearly this time, even if he chose not to react, because reacting meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant choosing, and he was not ready to do that yet, and the woman seemed to hear it too, her head tilting just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, and for the first time since she had stepped inside, a shadow of something crossed her face, not panic, not regret, just awareness, like she had been expecting this moment all along. And Ethan shifted his weight, the floor creaking softly beneath his boots. "You got people looking for you," he said, not a question, just a statement, and she did not answer right away. Instead, she reached into the folds of her worn clothing and pulled out something small, something that caught the firelight in a way that made it impossible to ignore, a piece of stone wrapped in thin silver wire. Simple, but crafted with care, and she held it in her palm for a second before closing her fingers around it again, as if even showing it for that brief moment carried weight, and then she looked back at him. "Not for the reason you think," she said, and her voice carried no fear, only certainty, and Ethan studied her, the words settling between them, and he realized something then that he had not allowed himself to consider before. This was not someone running from guilt, this was someone carrying something that others wanted, something that had nothing to do with him, and yet had found its way to his door all the same. And the thought pressed against his mind like a slow tightening grip, because trouble did not need permission to enter a man's life. It only needed a path, and sometimes that path was as simple as opening a door on a cold night, and outside, the sound of hooves grew louder, circling now, not rushing in, not announcing themselves, just there, like a presence waiting to be acknowledged. And Ethan's gaze flicked once toward the window, the glass catching only darkness and the faint reflection of firelight, and then back to the woman, who had not moved from her place by the flames, her posture still, composed, as if she had already accepted whatever was coming next, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because men feared what they could not control, but they understood it. This was different. This was something he could not even place. And the silence between them stretched again, thicker this time, heavier, until Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "You said you would repay me." And she nodded once, slow, certain. "I will," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to convince him, just truth, plain and unadorned, and for reasons he could not fully explain, that made him believe her more than any promise shouted in desperation ever could. And the fire crackled again, louder this time, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney, and outside, the horses stopped moving, the sound of hooves fading into a stillness that felt far louder than the noise had been, and Ethan felt it then, that shift in the air, the kind that came right before something revealed itself, and he knew, without needing to look, that whatever had followed her here was no longer searching. It had found exactly what it came for. And for the first time since the knock on his door, Ethan Cole understood that the night was not the beginning of this story. It was only the moment he stepped into it. Silence settled over the land like fresh snow, thick and unmoving, and Ethan Cole stood there listening to it, because out here silence was never empty. It carried weight, it carried intention, and tonight it carried something else, something that had chosen not to rush, not to shout, but to wait. And that made it more dangerous than anything that came charging through the dark. And he turned slowly toward the door, his eyes narrowing just slightly as the fire behind him cast a dim glow across the room, stretching his shadow long across the floor until it nearly touched the woman standing by the hearth. And she had not moved, not since the sound outside had faded, not since the air had shifted into that heavy stillness. And yet there was no fear in her posture, no urgency, only a quiet readiness, as if she had stepped into this moment long before it arrived. And Ethan found himself studying that more than the silence beyond his walls, because a person who did not fear what waited outside either did not understand it or understood it far too well, and something told him she was not the kind to misunderstand anything. And after a long breath, he reached for his coat hanging near the door, not in haste, not in panic, just a simple movement, the kind a man made when he knew standing still would not change what was coming next. And the leather creaked softly as he slipped it on, the familiar weight settling across his shoulders. Like an old habit he never quite let go of, and behind him, the fire popped again, sending a brief flicker of light across the walls. And in that moment, the woman finally spoke, her voice low, almost thoughtful. "If you open that door now, you choose what happens next." And Ethan paused, his hand resting on the handle, not turning it yet, just feeling the cold seep through the wood into his palm, and he let out a quiet breath. "Seems like that choice was made the moment I let you in," he said. And for the first time, something in her expression shifted, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something closer to respect, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but they're all the same. And she stepped slightly closer, the firelight catching the edges of her face, softening the lines of exhaustion that had been carved there by the night. And she opened her hand again, revealing that small stone wrapped in silver, the surface worn smooth by time, and she held it toward him, not offering it, not yet, just letting him see it clearly. And Ethan's gaze dropped to it for a moment, taking in the details, the craftsmanship, the quiet significance that seemed to cling to it like a memory. And he felt something stir in the back of his mind, something distant, something he could not quite place. But before he could follow that thought, a sound came from outside, closer now, a single step in the snow, deliberate, unhurried, and then another. And Ethan lifted his head, his attention snapping back to the door as the reality of what waited beyond it pressed in again. And the woman closed her hand around the stone once more, lowering it slowly. "They will not knock," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only certainty. And Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to her, because he had already figured that much. And with a steady motion, he turned the handle and pulled the door open, the cold rushing in once again, sharper now, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and horses. And something else, something older, something that did not belong to the wind or the land, but to the people who moved through it. And as the door swung wide, the scene outside revealed itself not in chaos, not in threat, but in stillness, a line of riders standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, their figures outlined against the pale glow of the snow, unmoving, watching. And Ethan stepped forward onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath his weight as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. And he counted them without meaning to, 1, 5, 10, more beyond that, their presence stretching into the darkness in a way that made counting feel pointless. And none of them reached for anything, none of them spoke, they simply waited. And at the front of that silent line, one figure shifted slightly, stepping forward just enough to break from the others. And even from a distance, there was something different in the way that rider carried themselves, something that did not demand attention, but held it all the same. And Ethan felt the weight of that moment settle fully now. The understanding that whatever had followed the woman to his door had not come for noise or conflict, it had come for something else entirely. And behind him, he could feel her presence still inside the cabin, quiet, steady, as if she trusted what would happen next without needing to see it. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole realized that this was not a night he could walk away from, not by closing a door, not by turning his back, because some choices, once made, did not belong to a single moment. They stretched forward, shaping everything that came after, and standing there in the cold, facing the silent riders beneath the open sky, he understood that whatever this was, it had only just begun. The cold did not move, and neither did the riders. And that was the first thing Ethan Cole understood as he stood on the porch, the wind brushing past him like it had forgotten everything else in the world except this moment. And the man at the front of the line stepped forward just enough for the firelight from the cabin to reach him, revealing a face marked not by anger, but by time. Lines carved deep by years of watching and deciding and carrying the weight of more than one life. And his eyes lifted to Ethan without challenge, without hostility, just presence. And for a long second, neither man spoke, because words had a way of breaking things that silence could hold together, and Ethan felt it then, that strange balance, like standing on the edge of something that could tip either way depending on what came next. And behind him, inside the cabin, the fire cracked softly, a reminder that warmth still existed somewhere in the world. And then the man in front raised one hand, slow, deliberate, not reaching for anything, just a signal. And the rest of the riders behind him did not move, did not shift. They remained exactly as they were, as if the entire line answered to that single gesture. And Ethan watched carefully, his breath steady, his shoulders relaxed but ready, because out here readiness was not about drawing first, it was about knowing when not to. And the man's voice came across the distance, calm, measured, carrying easily through the cold air. "You opened your door," he said. And it was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement. And Ethan gave a small nod. "I did," he answered, and the words felt heavier than they should have, like they carried more than just the truth of the moment. And the man studied him for a second longer, then glanced past him toward the cabin, toward the faint glow of the fire inside. And when his eyes returned, there was something different in them, something quieter, something that did not belong to judgment but to recognition. And he inclined his head just slightly, a movement so small it could have been missed if Ethan had not been watching so closely. And then he spoke again. Few men do. And that was all. No threat, no demand, just those 4 words. And they settled into the air between them like something solid, something real. And Ethan felt the tension in his chest shift, not disappear, but change shape, because whatever he had expected to find out here, it was not this, not silence, not restraint. Not a man who spoke as if the outcome had already been decided before he arrived. And from inside the cabin, there was a faint movement, the soft sound of boots against wood. And Ethan did not turn, but he knew she had stepped closer, could feel her presence just behind him now. And the man in front saw it too, his gaze flicking briefly toward the doorway before returning to Ethan. And this time when he spoke, his voice carried something deeper, something that reached beyond the moment. "She came to you," he said, and again, not a question, and Ethan answered the same way. "She did." And the man exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air, and for the first time, the weight he carried showed itself, not in weakness, but in responsibility, and he nodded once more, slower this time. "Then you have already done what matters," he said, and the words did not come with explanation, did not need one, and Ethan stood there, letting them settle, trying to understand what they meant. And before he could ask, before he could say anything more, the man stepped back, just one step, returning to his place at the front of the line. And as he did, something shifted among the riders, not movement, not noise, but intention, like a single thought passing through many minds at once. And then, one by one, without command, without signal, the riders lowered their heads. A motion so unified it felt like the land itself had breathed, and Ethan felt the weight of that more than anything else, because respect given freely was something he had not seen in a long time, not out here, not anywhere. And he stood there in the cold, not knowing what to do with it, not knowing what it asked of him. And behind him, the woman stepped forward just enough for the light to touch her face, and she looked past him toward the riders, her expression calm, unchanged, as if this was exactly how it was meant to unfold. And for a moment, the 3 of them existed in that space together. The man who had opened the door, the woman who had crossed it, and the ones who had followed without raising a single voice. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan Cole realized that whatever he thought he understood about this land, about these people, about the lines that had been drawn long before he was born. It was not as simple as he had believed, because sometimes the quietest moments carried the greatest weight, and sometimes the choice to let someone in did not bring danger to your door. It brought something else entirely, something a man could not measure with fear or profit, something that did not ask to be explained, only witnessed. And as the wind finally moved again, softer now, carrying away the stillness that had held them all in place, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not the end of what had begun that night. It was only the moment he started to see it for what it truly was. The riders did not rush, did not press forward. And that told Ethan Cole more than any show of force ever could. Because men who carried power did not need to prove it. And as the wind softened and drifted across the open land, the line of horses remained steady, their breath rising in slow white clouds against the morning light beginning to touch the horizon. And Ethan stood there a moment longer, letting the weight of what he had just witnessed settle into something he could carry, something he could understand, even if only a little. And behind him, the warmth of the cabin still reached out through the open door, a quiet contrast to the cold world outside. And then he stepped back, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, turning slightly as if to return inside. And as he did, the woman moved past him, her steps measured, unhurried, the same quiet certainty in her posture that had been there from the moment she arrived. And she stopped at the edge of the porch, facing the riders fully now. And for the first time, Ethan saw her not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone stepping into her place, whatever that place might be. And the man at the front inclined his head again, deeper this time, not as a greeting, but as something closer to respect, and the riders behind him mirrored the motion, a wave of stillness passing through them as they lowered their gaze. And no one spoke, no one needed to, because whatever understanding existed between them did not rely on words. And Ethan watched it unfold, feeling like a man standing at the edge of a story that had been moving long before he ever stepped into it. And the woman lifted her hand slightly, the one that held the small stone, wrapped in silver, and for a moment, the light caught it just right, sending a faint glimmer across the cold air, and the man at the front took a single step forward, his eyes fixed on that small object, and something in his expression shifted, softened, as if the sight of it carried meaning far beyond its size. And he spoke quietly, not to Ethan, but to her. And though the words were not in a language Ethan understood, the tone carried something clear enough, recognition, perhaps even relief. And the woman answered just as softly, her voice steady, and as she spoke, she extended her hand, offering the stone forward. And the man did not take it immediately. Instead, he paused, looking at her as if measuring something unseen, something deeper than the moment. And then, slowly, he reached out and closed his fingers around it, holding it with care that bordered on reverence. And when he looked back up, his gaze shifted to Ethan once more, and this time there was no distance in it, no separation, just a quiet acknowledgement that passed between two men who had made choices that led them here. And he gave a single nod, small but deliberate, and then stepped back again, returning to his place among the riders. And without command, without signal, the line began to move, not in a rush, not in chaos, but in a slow, unified motion, turning away from the cabin as if the purpose that had brought them here had already been fulfilled. And Ethan watched as they rode off, their figures fading into the pale light of morning, becoming part of the land once more, until only the tracks in the snow remained, a quiet reminder that they had ever been there at all. And the silence that followed was different now, lighter somehow, as if the air itself had exhaled. And Ethan stood there for a long moment, looking out across the empty stretch where they had been, trying to make sense of what had just passed through his life like a quiet storm. And behind him, the woman remained still, her gaze following the riders until they disappeared completely. And then she turned, stepping back into the cabin without a word. And Ethan followed after a second, closing the door behind him, the familiar sound of wood meeting frame grounding him in something real again. And the fire still burned low, steady, unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet everything felt different. And he leaned against the door for a moment, his eyes drifting to the place where she stood. And she looked at him then, not as a stranger, not as someone asking for anything, but as someone who had already given something in return. even if he did not yet understand what it was, and the silence between them settled once more. But it was no longer heavy, no longer filled with uncertainty. It was something else now, something closer to clarity. And Ethan realized that whatever reward she had promised had never been about gold or land or anything a man could hold in his hands. It had been something quieter, something harder to measure, something that did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a moment like this, a moment where a man could see beyond what he had been told, beyond what he had believed, and understand that sometimes the greatest change did not come from what you gained, but from what you chose to see differently. When the night was over, the cabin felt smaller after they left, not because the walls had changed, but because something inside Ethan Cole had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, like a door opening where there had only ever been a wall. And he stood there near the hearth, watching the fire settle into a steady glow, the kind that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. And the woman moved about the room with the same calm presence she had carried since the moment she arrived, no longer a stranger seeking warmth, but not entirely someone who belonged either. And that space between those two things was where she remained, balanced, certain, and Ethan found himself studying that more than anything else, because out here, people were usually one thing or the other, friend or threat, known or unknown, but she did not fit into either, and that unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. And after a long silence, he spoke, not to question, but to understand. "That stone," he said, his voice low, steady. It meant something to them. And she glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. And for the first time, there was something softer there, not vulnerability, but openness, like a door left slightly ajar. "It still does," she replied, and the words carried weight, not because of what they said, but because of what they did not. And Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, letting it settle, and he leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossing loosely, his gaze never leaving her. "You knew they would come," he said, and she did not deny it, did not explain it. She simply met his eyes and said, "I knew they would find what they were looking for." And that answer lingered, stretching beyond the moment. And Ethan exhaled quietly, a faint breath that carried more thought than sound, because he was beginning to understand that this was never about being chased or hunted, not in the way he had first believed. This was something else entirely, something that moved with purpose, not fear. And outside, the morning had begun to take hold, the pale light spreading across the land, touching the snow with a soft glow that made everything look cleaner than it truly was. And Ethan walked to the window, glancing out at the empty stretch where the riders had been, the tracks already beginning to fade under the wind. And for a moment, he wondered how many things in this world disappeared the same way, leaving behind only the faintest trace of something that had once mattered. And when he turned back, she was watching him, not with curiosity, but with understanding, as if she had followed that same thought long before he reached it. And she stepped closer, stopping just short of the table, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, but filled with something quieter, something that did not need to be named. And then she reached into her clothing again, her hand moving with care, and when she brought it out, it was empty, and Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in realization, because the stone was gone, given, returned to where it belonged. And she noticed the shift in his expression, the subtle change, and she nodded once, as if confirming something he had not yet put into words. "Some things are not meant to be kept," she said, and Ethan let out a faint breath, almost a quiet laugh without humor. "Seems like most things out here are taken, not given back," he replied, and she held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "Only when people forget what they are worth," she said, and the words landed deeper than he expected, not because they were loud or forceful, but because they carried a truth he had not heard in a long time. And he looked away for a second, his eyes drifting back to the fire, watching the flames shift and settle, and he realized something then, something simple and yet difficult to accept, that the reward she had promised was never meant to change his life in some grand, visible way. It was meant to show him something he had stopped seeing, something he had chosen not to believe in anymore. And as that thought settled, he felt a strange kind of clarity, not loud, not overwhelming, just present, like the steady warmth of the fire that had been there all along. And after a moment, she turned toward the door, her movement calm, certain, and Ethan straightened slightly, watching her as she reached for the handle. And he spoke before he could stop himself. "You are leaving," he said, and she paused, her hand resting on the wood, and she glanced back at him, her expression unchanged. "I was never staying," she replied. And there was no sadness in it, no regret, just truth. And Ethan nodded slowly, because he understood that now, understood that some people pass through your life not to remain, but to leave something behind, something that stayed long after they were gone. And she opened the door, the cold air slipping in once more, softer now, less biting, and as she stepped out onto the porch, the morning light caught her fully, illuminating her in a way the fire never could, and for a brief moment, she turned back, meeting his eyes one last time. And though she said nothing, there was something in that look, something final, something complete. And then she stepped down into the snow and walked away, her figure moving steadily across the open land, not looking back again. And Ethan stood in the doorway, watching until she disappeared into the distance. And when she was gone, he closed the door slowly, the sound echoing softly through the cabin. And he turned back to the fire, the same room, and yet nothing felt the same anymore. And he stood there in the quiet, understanding at last that some nights did not bring change with noise or force. They brought it quietly, leaving a man to realize, long after the door had closed, that he was no longer the same person who had opened it. Morning did not rush that day. It unfolded slowly across the land like it had something to consider, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way the light crept through the cracks of his cabin, soft and deliberate, touching the same walls that had stood unchanged for years, yet now seemed to carry something different, something quieter but heavier. And he moved through the room with the same routine his body remembered even if his mind had not fully caught up, pouring water into a tin cup, adding grounds, letting the fire do its work, the small familiar sounds filling the silence left behind by her absence. And still, every movement felt slightly off, like walking a path that looked the same but no longer led to the same place. And he stepped outside after a while, the cold gentler now, the air clearer, and the land stretched wide before him, untouched except for the faint tracks that remained where she had walked, already softening under the morning wind. And he stood there looking at them, not because he needed to follow, but because he understood that some things were not meant to be followed, only remembered. And he turned toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, but there was nothing there now, no sign of them, no sound, just open land and sky. And yet the absence felt full, like something had passed through and left its shape behind. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to fill the silence with anything else. And the day moved forward as it always did, chores waiting, fences to check, animals to tend, the quiet rhythm of a life built on repetition. And he followed that rhythm, step by step, because that was what a man did when there was nothing else to hold on to. But something had changed in the way he saw it all. The same fence line he had walked 100 times now felt less like a boundary and more like a choice. The same open land less like isolation and more like space. And it was not a sudden realization, not something that struck like lightning. It was quieter than that, like a slow shift in the way the world settled around him. And by midday, the sun had climbed higher, the snow reflecting light that forced his eyes to narrow, and he found himself pausing near the far edge of his property, looking out beyond the line where his land ended and the rest of the world began. And for years, that line had meant something fixed, something certain, but now it felt thinner somehow, less defined, as if it had always been more in his mind than in the ground itself. And he stood there for a long moment, letting that thought take shape. And then he turned back toward the cabin, his steps steady, unhurried. And when he reached the porch, he stopped again, his eyes drifting to the door, the same door that had been just wood and hinges the day before, and now felt like something else entirely, something that had marked a moment he would not be able to step back from. And he rested his hand against it briefly, not to open it, not to close it, just to feel it there, solid, real. And then he stepped inside, the warmth greeting him the same as always, and yet not the same at all. And the fire still burned, steady, unchanged, but he noticed things he had not before, The way the light shifted across the walls, the way the room held its quiet without pressing against him, and he moved through it with a different awareness, not searching, not questioning, just noticing. And as the afternoon stretched on, the wind picked up again, carrying new sounds across the land, distant, faint, and for a moment, Ethan paused, listening, the habit still there, the instinct that had kept him alive for years. But this time, there was no tension in it, no expectation of threat, just attention, and when nothing came of it, he returned to his work without a second thought, and that, more than anything, told him how much had shifted, because before, he would have watched the horizon until night fell, waiting for something to prove his caution right. But now, he let it pass, and as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan found himself back by the fire once more, the same place where the night had begun, and he stood there for a moment, looking into the flames, remembering not the fear or the uncertainty, but the quiet certainty that had followed. And he realized then that the reward she had spoken of had already been given, not in something he could count or hold, but in something far less visible, far more lasting, a shift in the way he saw the world, in the way he understood the people who moved through it, and in the way he understood himself. And as the light faded and the cabin settled into the calm of evening once again, Ethan Cole sat down, the fire steady. Before him, the silence no longer empty. And for the first time in years, he did not feel alone in it. The night returned the way it always did, slow and certain, stretching shadows across the land until the horizon disappeared into something deeper and quieter. And Ethan Cole sat by the fire with his hands resting loosely on his knees, not working, not planning, just listening, because the silence had changed again. And this time it carried something steady, something that did not press against him but stayed with him. And outside the wind moved in long, even breaths, brushing across the cabin walls and slipping through the spaces between boards like it had done 1,000 nights before, yet it no longer sounded the same, no longer carried that edge of warning he had grown used to. And Ethan found himself noticing the difference without trying to explain it, the way a man notices the shift of seasons without needing to name it. And the fire burned low, steady, casting a soft glow that reached only as far as it needed to, leaving the rest of the room in a comfortable shadow. And he leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the flames as they folded and rose, thinking not of what had happened, but of what had not, of the choices he had not made, the door he had not closed, the suspicion he had not followed. And it struck him then how much of a man's life was shaped not by the things he did, but by the things he chose not to do. And that thought stayed with him as the hours passed, unhurried, until the fire settled into embers and the cabin grew quieter still. And when he finally stood, moving to add another piece of wood, the small crack of it catching flame echoed louder than it should have, as if the space itself was listening. And he paused, his hand resting lightly against the mantel, his eyes drifting toward the door again, not out of expectation, not waiting for another knock, but because that door now held a meaning it never had before. And he understood that there would be other nights, other moments where a choice would stand on the other side of it, and he would not be the same man answering. And that realization did not come with pride or fear. It came with something steadier, something closer to acceptance. And he stepped away from the fire after a moment, moving to the small table where his cup sat, now cold, untouched, and he lifted it, taking a slow sip without thinking, the bitter taste grounding him in something simple and real. And outside, the stars had come out, clear and sharp against the dark sky, stretching wide above the land in a way that made everything below feel smaller and somehow more connected at the same time. And Ethan stepped out onto the porch again, the cold brushing against his face, not harsh, just present. And he looked up for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him, the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled. And as he stood there, his eyes drifting from the sky back to the land, he noticed something near the edge of the porch, something small against the snow, and he stepped down slowly, his boots pressing lightly into the surface as he moved closer. And there, just beside the place where her tracks had begun to fade earlier in the day, was a mark he had not seen before, not a footprint, not a sign of passage, but something placed, something deliberate. And he crouched slightly, brushing away a thin layer of snow to reveal it more clearly. And there, half buried, was a small piece of silver wire, simple, unadorned, shaped in a way that felt familiar. And Ethan's breath slowed as he picked it up, turning it gently between his fingers, recognizing it not as something lost, but as something left behind, a fragment of what had once held the stone she carried, now empty, now given away, and he stood there holding it, the cold air wrapping around him. And, for a moment, everything became still again, not the heavy stillness of before, but something lighter, something that carried meaning without weight. And he understood then that not all rewards arrive complete. Some came in pieces, in small reminders that stayed long after the moment had passed. And he closed his hand around the wire, not gripping it tightly, just holding it. And when he looked back out across the land, it no longer felt like something he stood apart from. It felt like something he was a part of, in a way he had not allowed himself to see before. And the wind moved again, soft and steady, carrying with it the faint scent of wood and earth. And Ethan Cole remained there for a while longer, not waiting, not searching, just standing in the quiet. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that the story that had come to his door that night had not ended when it walked away. It had simply changed shape, settling into something that would stay with him long after the tracks in the snow were gone. The silver wire felt lighter than it should have. And that was what stayed with Ethan Cole as he turned it slowly between his fingers under the open sky. Because something so small should not carry that kind of weight, not the kind that settled into a man's thoughts and refused to leave. And he stood there on the edge of his porch longer than he intended, the cold pressing gently against his coat, the night stretching quiet and wide around him. And for the first time in years, he did not measure that quiet by what might break it. He measured it by what it allowed him to hear. And what he heard now was not danger, not warning, but something steadier, something that had been there all along beneath the noise he had grown used to. And he slipped the piece of silver into his pocket, not as something valuable, not as something to keep safe, but as something to remember. And when he stepped back inside, closing the door behind him, the sound did not echo the same way it once had. It felt softer, like a chapter closing instead of a barrier being set. And the fire still burned low, casting its steady glow across the cabin, and Ethan moved toward it, kneeling briefly to adjust the wood, watching as the flames caught and grew just enough to hold the warmth. And he sat back again, his hands resting loosely, his gaze calm, and time passed the way it does when a man stops counting it, slow, unnoticed, until the night gave way to another morning. And the days that followed did not bring anything remarkable in the way stories usually tell it. There were no more riders, no more knocks, no sudden turns of fate that could be pointed to and named. And yet, something had changed in every small thing, in the way Ethan walked his land, in the way he listened to the wind, in the way he no longer looked at the horizon expecting it to take something from him, and instead began to see it as something that might bring something he had not yet understood. And a few days later, when he rode into town for supplies, the world he stepped into felt sharper, louder, filled with the kind of noise he had once accepted without question, voices rising and falling. Talk of weather, of cattle, of things that seemed important until you stepped away from them long enough to see them clearly. And as he moved through the street, tying his horse outside the general store, he caught pieces of conversation drifting through the air, familiar tones, familiar assumptions, men speaking about things they believed they understood, and he paused just for a moment, listening without reacting. And he realized how easily he could have been one of them, how easily he had been one of them, repeating what was said because it was easier than questioning it. And he stepped inside the store after that, the bell above the door giving a soft ring. And the owner nodded in greeting, nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and Ethan gathered what he needed, flour, coffee, a few small supplies, moving through the space with the same quiet presence he always had. But when he stepped back outside, something caught his eye across the street. A small group gathered near the edge of the road, their attention fixed on something just beyond view. And Ethan did not rush toward it, did not assume anything. He simply walked closer, steady, unhurried. And as the crowd shifted slightly, he saw what they were looking at. Not a threat, not a conflict, just a young figure standing alone, wrapped against the cold, watching the town with a calm that did not match the tension around them. And for a brief moment, Ethan felt that same quiet recognition he had felt before, that same sense that this was not a moment to react, but a moment to choose, and the voices around him carried uncertainty, hesitation, the kind that often led to decisions made too quickly, and Ethan stood there, his hand resting near his coat, not reaching for anything, just grounded, and he remembered the night, the door, the choice, and without thinking about it further, he stepped forward, not to confront, not to challenge, but simply to stand where he needed to stand, and the movement was small, almost unnoticed, but it shifted something, the same way a single step had shifted everything before, and the air changed slightly, the tension easing just enough to allow something else to exist in its place, and Ethan did not speak, did not need to, because he understood now that not every moment required words, some only required presence, and as he stood there, steady and quiet, he realized that the story that had come to his door had not ended in that cabin. It had followed him, not as a burden, not as something unresolved, but as something that continued, shaping each choice in ways he could not always see, and for the first time in a long while. That did not trouble him, it steadied him, because he understood now that what a man carries forward is not always something he chooses, but what he does with it always. As the air in the town shifted in ways most people did not notice, but Ethan Cole did, because once a man had learned to listen beyond the noise, he could not unlearn it. And as he stood there among the others, watching the quiet figure at the edge of the street, he felt the same stillness he had felt that night, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting to be understood, and the people around him shifted their weight, exchanged glances, their voices low, uncertain, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, the kind that grows when fear is passed down more often than truth, and Ethan saw it clearly now, the way hesitation could turn into judgment if no one stepped forward to hold the line between the two. And so he did not move away, did not lower his gaze. He simply stood where he was, steady, quiet, and that alone began to change the shape of the moment, because presence, when held without anger or fear, has a way of settling things before they ever rise, and the figure across the street did not move either, their posture calm, eyes steady, as if they too understood that what happened next would not be decided by words alone, and the wind moved through the space between them, carrying dust and light, soft enough to blur the edges of the scene, and in that softened space, something shifted. One man near the front lowered his voice, another stepped back half a pace, small movements, barely noticeable, but real, and Ethan felt it, that subtle change, the same way he had felt the riders lower their heads in silence. And he realized that not all turning points announced themselves, some arrive quietly, carried by the choice of a single person to remain where others might step away, and after a long moment, the figure at the edge of the road turned slightly, not in retreat, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, and began to walk away, their steps unhurried, steady, leaving no trace of tension behind, and the crowd did not follow, did not call out. They simply watched until the distance took the figure out of sight, and then the noise of the town returned, slower at first, as if it needed to remember how to exist again, and Ethan stood there a moment longer before turning back toward his horse, his movements calm, grounded, and as he untied the reins, the shopkeeper from earlier stepped out onto the porch, glancing at him with a look that held more question than judgment, and after a second, the man spoke, not loudly, just enough to be heard. "You did not say a word," and Ethan placed his hand on the saddle, brushing away a bit of dust before answering. "Did not need to," and the man nodded slowly, as if considering something he had not thought about before, and did not press further, and Ethan mounted his horse after that, turning it toward the open road that led back to his land, and as he rode, the town faded behind him, its sounds carried away by distance, leaving only the steady rhythm of hooves and the quiet stretch of land ahead, and the sky above was wide and clear, the kind that made a man feel both small and certain at the same time, and he rode without hurry, letting the path unfold beneath him, not thinking about where he had been or where he was going, just moving forward, and somewhere along that ride, his hand drifted to his coat pocket, feeling the faint shape of the silver wire still there, and he paused his horse for a moment, pulling it out and holding it up to the light, the thin metal catching the sun just enough to glimmer, and he studied it for a second, not searching for meaning, but recognizing it, the way a man recognizes something that has already become part of him, and then he slipped it back into his pocket and continued on, the land opening wider with each mile. And when his cabin finally came into view in the distance, small against the vastness around it, Ethan did not see it the way he once had, not as a place set apart, but as a place connected, a point in a larger story that stretched beyond what he could see. And as he approached, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the familiar scent of wood and earth, and he dismounted near the porch, tying his horse with the same steady hands. And when he stepped up to the door, he paused for just a second, his hand resting against it, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm. And then he opened it without hesitation, stepping inside as the firelight greeted him once more. And in that simple act, there was something different now. Not caution, not reluctance, just certainty. Because he understood at last that a door was never just a barrier. It was always a choice. And the kind of man who stood before it mattered more than what waited on the other side. The fire greeted him the same way it always did, steady and patient, as if it had been waiting without question. And Ethan Cole stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet certainty that no longer needed to be forced. And for a moment he stood there, letting the warmth settle into his coat, into his hands, into the space behind his ribs where something had been tight for longer than he cared to admit. And he moved slowly across the room, setting down the few supplies he had brought from town, each motion deliberate, grounded, as if he was learning again how to exist in a place that had never changed and yet felt entirely different. And the cabin held him without resistance, the walls no longer pressing inward, but simply standing where they always had. And that alone told him how much of what he had carried before had never truly belonged to the space itself. And he knelt near the fire, adjusting the wood with a careful hand, watching the flames take hold, not rushing them, not forcing them higher than they needed to be, because he understood now that not everything had to burn bright to matter. Some things were meant to last, not to impress. And as the fire settled into a steady glow, he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting across the room, taking in details he had stopped seeing years ago, the worn edge of the table, the faint mark on the wall near the window, the quiet way the light moved across the floor as the flames shifted. And none of it was new, but all of it felt seen, and that difference settled deep, quiet and lasting. And time moved forward the way it always did, measured not by clocks but by light and shadow, by the way the sun slipped across the sky and gave way to evening without asking permission. And Ethan followed that rhythm without resistance, tending to small tasks, preparing what he needed, not because he had to, but because it felt right to continue, to move, to stay part of the world instead of standing apart from it. And as the day softened into dusk once more, he found himself at the doorway again, not out of habit, not out of expectation, but because something in him understood that this place, this threshold, was where things had changed. And he stepped outside, the air cool but not harsh, the land stretching quiet and open before him. And he looked out across it without searching, without waiting for something to appear. And that was new, that absence of expectation, that quiet acceptance of what was simply there. And as he stood there, his hand drifted once more to his coat pocket, feeling the faint shape of the silver wire. And he took it out, holding it between his fingers as the last light of the day caught it. And he turned it slowly, watching how something so small could still reflect the sky, could still hold light even after what it once carried was gone. And he understood then that its value had never been in what it held, but in what it had been part of, what it had connected. And he closed his hand around it again, not to keep it hidden, but to keep it close. And behind him, the firelight spilled softly through the open door, reaching out just enough to touch the edge of the porch, a quiet invitation that did not need to be spoken. And Ethan turned back after a moment, stepping inside once more. And as he did, he paused just long enough to leave the door open a little wider than he would have before, not because he expected anyone to come, but because he no longer felt the need to shut the world out entirely. And that small change carried more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. And he moved back to the fire, sitting down as the night settled in, the cabin holding its quiet the same way it always had. And yet now that quiet felt shared, not with a person, not with a presence he could see, but with something deeper, something that had taken root in the choices he had made and the understanding that had followed. And as the flames shifted and the shadows moved along the walls, Ethan Cole sat there without hurry, without restlessness, and for the first time, the silence did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something to live within, something that carried meaning without needing to speak it aloud. And somewhere in that stillness, he understood that the night that had come to his door had not taken anything from him. It had given something back, something he had not known he had lost. And that was not something that would fade with time. It was something that would remain, shaping every quiet moment that followed. The night deepened without asking for attention, settling over the land with a quiet certainty that felt familiar now, and Ethan Cole remained seated by the fire, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, the kind of stillness that only comes when a man no longer feels the need to measure every sound against the possibility of something breaking it. And the cabin held that stillness well, the walls no longer closing in, but simply standing, unchanged, as they always had. And yet he understood now that it had never been the space that confined him. It had been the way he had chosen to see it. And that realization moved through him slowly, not as a sudden shift, but as something that had been unfolding ever since that night, each moment layering quietly over the last until it became something solid, something he could stand on. And the fire gave a soft crack, drawing his attention back to the present, the flames steady, patient, not reaching higher than they needed to, and he leaned forward slightly, adjusting the wood with a careful hand, watching how even the smallest change could guide the way something burned. And he thought about that for a moment, about how little it sometimes took to change the direction of something larger, not by force, not by control, but by understanding where to place your hand. And he sat back again, his gaze drifting toward the open door, still left slightly ajar, the cold air slipping in just enough to remind him that the world beyond his walls had not disappeared. It had simply become something he no longer needed to shut out. And outside, the stars stretched wide across the sky, clear and unbroken. And for a moment, he found himself standing again, stepping toward the doorway, not because he was drawn by something unknown, but because he was no longer avoiding it. And he stepped out onto the porch, the cold brushing against his face, softer now, less like a warning and more like a presence. And he looked out across the land, the same land he had known for years. And yet now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. And that difference was enough to shift everything. And as he stood there, his hand resting loosely at his side, he felt the faint weight of the silver wire still in his pocket, and he reached for it again, pulling it out and holding it up to the starlight, the thin metal catching just enough of it to glow faintly. And he studied it not as an object, but as a reminder, a quiet piece of something larger that had passed through his life and left its mark without asking for anything in return. And he realized then that what he had been given was not meant to be understood all at once. It was meant to be carried, to shape the way he moved through the world in ways he would only notice when he looked back. And he closed his hand around it once more, slipping it back into his pocket, not out of habit, but with intention. And as he did, a sound reached him, faint at first, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the rise of the land. And he did not tense, did not reach for anything. He simply listened, the way he had learned to, and the sound grew clearer, not hooves, not voices, just movement, distant, steady. And he watched the horizon, not expecting, not fearing, just observing. And after a moment, a small shape appeared against the pale edge of the land, moving slowly, unhurried. And Ethan remained still, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, because he understood now that not every approach was a threat, and not every unknown needed to be met with resistance. And the shape came closer, resolving into a rider, alone, moving with the same quiet certainty he had seen before. And as the distance closed, the rider slowed, stopping just beyond the edge of the porch. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them familiar now, not empty, not heavy, but full. And the rider inclined their head slightly, not in deference, but in acknowledgement. And Ethan returned the gesture just as simply, and no words followed. None were needed, because whatever had begun that night had not ended. It had only taken on a different form, one that moved quietly, without force, without demand. And as the rider turned and began to move away again, disappearing back into the open land as naturally as they had appeared, Ethan stood there watching, not to follow, not to question, just to witness. and when the horizon returned to its empty stillness, he remained a moment longer before turning back toward the cabin, stepping inside and closing the door gently behind him. And the fire waited, steady as ever, and Ethan Cole sat once more in its glow, understanding now that some stories do not end with a final moment. They continue in the quiet choices a man makes long after the noise has passed. The fire had settled into a deep, steady glow, the kind that did not flicker wildly or demand attention, but stayed, patient and constant. And Ethan Cole sat in its light with his hands resting loosely, his posture calm, his breathing even, as if the rhythm of the flame had found its way into him. And outside, the night stretched wide and unbroken, holding the land in a silence that no longer felt empty, no longer felt like something waiting to be filled, but something complete in its own quiet way. And for a long moment, nothing moved, nothing shifted, and yet everything felt alive, connected, present, and Ethan let that feeling settle without trying to name it, because he understood now that not everything needed to be explained to be real. And the memory of that night did not return to him as a sharp image or a sudden thought. It lived in the way he sat, in the way he listened, in the way he no longer reached for certainty before allowing something to exist. And he leaned forward slightly, adding one more piece of wood to the fire, not because it was needed, but because it felt right. And as the flame caught and grew just enough to hold its shape, he watched it with a quiet focus, understanding that even the smallest action could carry meaning when done with intention. And time passed the way it does when a man is no longer counting it, slow, unnoticed, until the fire softened again and the night deepened further, and Ethan stood, not out of restlessness, but out of a quiet instinct, and he walked toward the door, his hand resting against it for a brief moment before opening it. And the cold air met him once more, gentle now, familiar, and he stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight, and he looked out across the land, the same wide stretch of earth and sky that had once felt like distance, like separation, and now felt like something else entirely, something open, something shared. And the stars above shone clear and steady, their light reaching down without effort, touching everything equally without asking what it was or where it belonged. And Ethan stood there, his gaze lifting for a moment before returning to the horizon, and he did not search it, did not expect anything to appear, because he understood now that not every story needed to return in the same form to continue. And as he stood there, the wind moved again, soft and steady, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and smoke, and something else, something subtle, something that reminded him of that night without bringing it back fully. And he let it pass through him, without holding on to it, because he knew now that holding too tightly was not the same as remembering. And after a while, he stepped down from the porch, his boots pressing lightly into the snow, and he walked a short distance out, stopping where the ground opened up fully before him. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out the small piece of silver wire once more, holding it in the open air, letting the starlight touch it. And he turned it slowly between his fingers, not searching for anything new, just acknowledging what it had become, not a fragment of something lost, but a piece of something that had fulfilled its purpose. And he realized then that what had been given to him had never been meant to stay in one form. It had been meant to move, to change, to become part of something larger than itself, and that included him. And he closed his hand around the wire one last time before slipping it back into his pocket, not as something to keep safe, but as something that no longer needed to be. And he looked out across the land again, the quiet stretching before him without boundary. And for a long moment, he simply stood there, present, steady, without needing to move or decide or measure what came next. And in that stillness, he understood something that had been building since the moment he opened that door. Something that had no need for words, no need for explanation. That out here, where the wind carried stories without speaking them, and the land held memory without showing it, justice did not always arrive with noise or force. It arrived in the quiet choices a man made when no one was watching, in the way he chose to see others, in the way he chose to stand when it would have been easier to step away. And as that understanding settled fully into him, Ethan Cole turned back toward the cabin, walking slowly, his steps steady. And when he reached the porch, he paused for just a second, looking at the door that had once been just wood and had become something more. and then he stepped inside, leaving it open behind him just a little, enough for the night air to slip in, enough for the world beyond to remain part of the space within, and the fire welcomed him back with the same steady glow, unchanged and yet entirely different, and he sat down once more, not as a man waiting for something to happen, but as a man who understood that what mattered had already begun and would continue, quietly, in every choice that followed.